Technical difficulties. This is the technical difficulties song. Good evening, everybody. So at 6 p.m, I set up this stream. I set up Streamlabs. I set up the bot. I connected to everything. Content once was working. Everything was working. I started the Streamlabs bot today, and it demanded an update. And now it no longer connects to anything. In fact, the little box that would let you to connect to anything at all is gone. So no Dracubot this evening, I'm afraid. I've tried to make it work. Hopefully I am visible and audible. Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Izumi Hikari. So botless. I must start this evening's reading, which is, as usual, from the Giant Book of Vampires. And the first two stories this evening are quite short, so I will do both of those. They're a few pages each, and then the third one is quite long, so I shall do that one after the break. So they are A Week in the Unlife, for which the content warnings are death, dying, violence, blood, necrophilia, necrophilia, apparently a difficult word to say, I hope an extremely difficult thing to do, and a mention of colonialism. The House at Evening, which has a few content, sex work and mind control, and the Labyrinth, which has violence, blood, death, dying, imprisonment, zombification, vomit/emetophobia, harm to animals, and mind control. So without any more further ado, I will proceed on the reading. David J Schow is one of the most original stylists. Oh God. Cursed stream. David J Schow is one of the most original stylists to emerge from the new wave of horror writers. His impressive short fiction began appearing a decade ago in small press, and in 1985 he won the Twilight Zone magazine's Dimension Award for Coming Soon to a Theatre Near You. 2 years later he picked up the World Fantasy Award for his story Red Light. Following a string of pseudonymous novels and a TV reference book, he made his full-length debut in 1988 with The Kill Riff, described as a rock and roll horror novel, while his second, The Shaft, remains published only in Britain. He edited Silver Scream, and the best of his stories have been collected in Seeing Red and Lost Angels. Other recent appearances are in Fantasy Tales, Iniquities, Weird Tales, Dark Voices 3, The Pan Book of Horror, A Whisper of Blood, and the Mammoth Book of Terror. Schow's work for Hollywood includes scripts for Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, Critters 3 and 4, and television's Freddy's Nightmares. He has completed work on 2 segments of the off-Broadway show Grand Guignol, based on Robert Bloch's stories. Schow believes that it is the oversaturation of vampire lore, and the trivialist's lust to accumulate ever more of it, that is itself a new form of vampirism. As a reaction against this, he wrote the following story, which he sums up as a vampire story with no vampires in it. When you stake a bloodsucker, the heart blood pumps out thick and black, the consistency of honey. I saw it make bubbles as it glurped out. The creature thrashed and squirmed, and tried to pull out the stake. They always do, if you leave on their arms for the kill. But by the third whack it was, as Stoker might say, dispatched well and duly. I lost count a long time ago. Doesn't matter. I no longer think of them as even former human beings, and feel no anthropomorphic sympathy. In their eyes I see no tragedy, no romance, no seductive pulp appeal, merely lust, rage at being outfoxed, and debased appetite, focused and sanguine. People usually commit journals as legacy. So be it. Call me sentry, vigilante if you like. When they sleep their comatose sleep, I stalk and terminate them. When they walk, I hide. Better than they do. They're really not as smart as popular fiction and films would lead you to believe. They do have cunning and animalistic savvy. But I'm an experienced tracker. I know their spoor, the traces they leave, the way their presence charges the air. Things invisible or ephemeral to ordinary citizens, blackly obvious to me. The journal is so you'll know, just in case my luck runs out. Sundown. Nap time. Naturally, the police think of me as some sort of homicidal crackpot. That's a given. Always has been for my predecessors. More watches to evade. Caution comes reflexively to me these days. Police are slow and rational. They deal in the minutiae of the day-to-day world. Deadly enough without the inclusion of bloodsuckers. The police love to stop and search people. Fortunately for me, mallets and stakes and crosses as such are not yet illegal in this country. Lots of raised eyebrows and jokes and nudging, but no actual arrests. When the time comes for them to recognise the plague that has descended upon their city, they will remember me, perhaps with grace. My lot is friendless, solo. I know and expect such. It's okay. City by city. I'm good at ferreting out the nests. To me, their kill patterns are like a flashing red light. The police only see presumed loonies drawn in linkages. They bust and imprison mortals and never see the light. I am not foolhardy enough to leave bloodsuckers lying. Even though the mean corpus usually dissolves, the stakes might be discovered. Sometimes there is other residue. City dumpsters and sewers provide adequate and fitting disposal for the leftovers of my mission. The enemy casualties. I wish I could advise the authorities, work hand in hand with them. Too complicated. Too many variables. Not a good control situation. Bloodsuckers have a maddening knack for vanishing into crevices, even hairline splits in logic. Rule. Trust no one. A female one today. Funny. There aren't as many of them as you might suppose. She had courted a human lover, so she claimed, like Romeo and Juliet. She could only visit him at night, and only after feeding, because bloodsuckers too can get carried away by passion. I think she was intimating that he was a physical lover of otherworldly skill. I think she was finding hard to tempt me not to eliminate her by saying so. She did not use her mouth to seduce mortal men. I drove the stake into her brain through the mouth. She was of recent vintage and did not melt or vaporize. When I fucked her remains, I was surprised to find her cold, warm inside. Not cold, like a cadaver. Warm. With some of them, the human warmth is longer in leaving, but it always goes. That was it. Segue there, sir. Just fine. I never met one before that gave up its existence without a struggle, but today I did, one that acted like he had been expecting me to wander along and relieve him of the burden of unlife. He did not deny what it was, nor attempt to trick me. He asked if he could talk a bit before. In the third-floor loft, the windows of which had been spray-painted flat black, he talked. Said he'd always hated the taste of blood. Said he preferred pineapple juice, or even coffee. He actually brewed a pot of coffee while we talked. I allowed him to finish his cup before I put the ashwood length into his chest and drove deep and let his blackness gush. It dribbled, thinned by the coffee he had consumed. Was thinking this afternoon perhaps I should start packing a Polaroid or some such to keep a visual body count, just in case this journal becomes public record someday. It'd be good to have illustrations, proof. I was thinking of that line you hear overused in the movies, I'm sure you know it, but there's no such thing as a vampire. What a howler. Frank's up there, alongside, it's crazy, but it might just work, and we can't stop now for a lot of silly native superstitions. Right. Shoot cozy little memory stabs in case they whiz to mist or drop apart to smoking goo. That bull about how you're not supposed to be able to record their images is from the movies too. There's so much misleading information running loose that the bloodsuckers, the real ones, have no trouble at all moving through any urban centre with impunity, as they say on cop shows. Maybe it would be a good idea to tape record the sounds they make when they die. Videotape them begging not to be exterminated. That would bug the eyes of all those monster movie fans, you bet. Yep, was not expecting that either. So many of them beleaguering the city, it's easy to feel outnumbered. Like I say, I've lost count. Tonight might be a good window for moving on. Like them, I become vulnerable if I remain too long, and it's prudent operating procedure not to leave patterns or become predictable. It's easy, I don't own much. Most of what I carry inside. They pulled me over on Highway 10, outbound, for a broken left tail light. A Datifax photo of me was clipped to the visor in the highway patrol car. The journal book itself has been taken as evidence, so for now it's a felt tip and a high school notebook paper, which notes I hope to append to the journal proper later. I have a cell with 4 bunks all to myself. The door is solid grey with a food slot, unlike the barred cage of the bullpen. On the way back I noticed they'd caught themselves a bloodsucker, probably an accident. They probably don't even know what they have. There is no sunrise or sunset in the block, so if he gets out at night, they'll never know what happened. But I already know. Right now I will not say anything. I am exposed, not at disadvantage. The one I let slip today can eliminate tenfold next week. New week, and I am vindicated at last. I relaxed as soon as they showed me the photographs. How they managed documentation of the last few bloodsuckers I trapped, I have no idea, but I was relieved. Now I don't have to explain the journal, which, as you can see, they returned to me immediately. They had thousands of questions. They needed to know about the mallets, the stakes, the preferred method of kill strike. I cautioned them not to attempt to sweep and clear at night when the enemy is stronger. They paid serious attention this time, which made me feel much better. Now the fight can be mounted en masse. They also let me know I wouldn't have to stay in the cell, just some paperwork to clear, and I'm out among them again. One of the officials, not a cop but a doctor, congratulated me on a stout job well done. He shook my hand on behalf of all of them, he said, and mentioned writing a book on my work. This is exciting. As per my request, the bloodsucker in the adjacent solitary cell was moved. I told him that to be really sure they should lose one of my stakes. It was a simple vanity, really, on my part. I turned my stakes out of ashwood on a lathe. I made sure they knew I'd permit my stakes to be used as working models for the proper manufacture of all they would soon need. When the guards come back, I really must ask how they managed to get such crisp 8x10s of so many bloodsuckers. All those names and dates. First-class documentation. I'm afraid I may be a bit envious. Thank you, Twitch. Let Jim watch the thing. So next one is Francis Garfield, A House at Evening. Francis Garfield was born in Texas and has lived in Chapel Hill, North Carolina since 1951, when she moved there with her husband, Manly Wade Wellman. During the late 1930s and the early 40s, she had 3 stories published in Weird Tales and another in Amazing Stories. After retiring from her job as a secretary in the School of Public Health, she kept thinking up ideas for horror stories and telling them to Wellman. He said they were women's stories and she would have to write them herself. Well, so Garfield returned to her typewriter, and over the years the results have been published in the year's best horror stories, the best horror from Fantasy Tales, Whispers, Fantasy Book, Kadath, The Tome, and others. The House at Evening is a wonderfully atmospheric vampire story that should make us all glad she returned to the fold. The sun had set and another twilight had begun. The western sky took on a rosy tinge, but none of the soft colour penetrated into the lofty bedroom. Claudia leaned towards the bureau. Her stormy black locks curtained her face as she brushed and brushed them. It was a luxurious, sensuous brushing. Her hair glistened in the light of the oil lamp. Across the room sat Garland. She quickly combed her short blonde hair into an elvish mop of curls. "Thank goodness I don't have to worry about a great banner like yours," she said. "Never you mind," Claudia laughed back. "We both know it's impressive." They both applied makeup generously. Claudia fringed her silvery eyes with deep blue mascara, and Garland brushed her pale eyebrows with brown. Each painted her lips a rosy red, and smiled tightly to smooth lipstick. They finished dressing and went down the squeaking staircase to the big parlour. Darkness crept in, stealthily but surely. They picked up jugs of oil and went about, filling and lighting all the ancient glass-domed lamps. Light flickered yellow from table and shelf and glistened on the wide hardwood floorboards. Claudia took pride in those old expanses, spending hours on her knees to rub them to a glow. Garland arranged a bowl filled with colourful gourds on the mahogany table that framed the back of the brocaded couch. She put 2 scented candles into holders and lighted them. Then they stood together to admire the effect of the soft light, Claudia in her red satin, Garland in her dark bright blue. They checked each other for flaws and found none. "I'd like to go walking outside the way we used to do," said Garland. She glanced down at her high-heeled slippers. They weren't too high. "I'll only be gone a little while." "There's not much to see out there," said Claudia. "Nobody much walks here anymore. It's been a long time since we've had company." "Maybe I'm just being sentimental," smiled Garland. Her eyes twinkled for a moment, as with some secret delight. "But maybe I'll bring somebody back." "I'll stay here in case anybody calls," Claudia assured her. The big wooden front door creaked shut behind Garland. She crossed the grey-floored piazza and ran down the steps to its path of old flagstones. Periwinkle overflowed them and knotted its roots everywhere. Ivy and honeysuckle choked the trees. Autumn leaves poured down from the oaks. An old dead dogwood leaned wearily on the lawn's edge. Garland picked her way carefully. An owl shrieked a message in the distance. Garland smiled to herself. She had worn no wrap out in the warm evening, but she nestled into the soft collar of her silky dress to feel its closeness. She breathed deeply of the night air. Falling leaves whispered like raindrops, but there were only vagrant clouds in the sky. A young moon shone on the old sidewalk upon old houses along the way. They were large, pretentious houses, the sort called Victorian. They were ramshackle. No light shone from any window. Garland might have been the only moving creature in the neighbourhood. Once this had been an elegant area, on the edge of the old town that existed mainly for Ellaby College, but people had moved out. Deterioration had set in. Urban renewal threatened the neighbourhood. All at once Garland heard something. Voices, hushed, furtive. She saw two tall young men coming towards her. She looked at them in the moonlight. They were handsome, sprucely dressed, looked like muscular young athletes. She hadn't seen their like for a while, and she felt a surge of warmth through her body. They were near now, she could hear what they said. "My Uncle Whit used to come here when he was in college," one young voice declared. "He said this was called Pink Hill. Said you'd be mighty well entertained." Probably done these in American accents, I guess. Now she passed them, and turned at once to go back towards her house. She quickened her steps. For a moment she didn't know whether to be sad or happy. If only she hadn't lost her touch, but she knew her body, firm, sweet-looking. As she passed them again, she spoke. "Hey!" she greeted them. One, tall with a neat dark beard, spoke shyly. "Nice evening, isn't it?" Garland smiled. If she had dimples, she would have flashed them. "Yes, but there's a chill in the air. I think I'll just go back home. Maybe some hot chocolate or tea?" Away she walked ahead, her hips swinging a trifle, not so fast as to lose touch with them. They seemed to be following her all right. The bearded one was speaking, and Garland strained her ears to hear. "After all," he was saying, "we did sort of think we were looking for experience." The other, the fair-haired athletic one, said something too soft for Garland to hear, but it sounded like agreement. She walked on, watching her feet on the treacherous pavement. There were so many cracks in that old cement. Sure enough, the two boys were coming along with her. Again, she felt a flood of, some experience. Again, she felt a flood of internal warmth. She felt almost young again. Almost as young as she must look. Carefully, she timed the sway of her hips. There was the house. Along the flagstone, she minced happily and up the steps and in at the door. "You're going to have company, Claudia," she said. Claudia swept the room with an appraising glance and smiled a cool smile. "Tell me," she said quickly. "Two really lovely young men coming along to follow me. One with bright hair and a football body. The other tall, bearded, neat, sophisticated looking. We have to do them credit. Well, there's a bottle of port out and some of these cheese biscuits I made." Claudia studied the table in the lamplight. "We'll be all right." From outside they heard footsteps on the porch and hesitant whispering. "They're beautiful," said Garland. Silence for an instant. Then a guarded tattoo of knocks on the panel of the door. A knock Garland guessed taught to them by good old Uncle Whit. "Okay, here we go," said Claudia, and gave Garland a triumphant look. "Remember your company manners." She glided to the door, her red gown hugging her opulent hips and her slim waist. Her dress was long. It swept the floor, and it accentuated every curve and hollow of the well-used body. She could be proud of how she looked, how she moved. She graduated magna cum laude in every way. She opened the door, and the lamplight touched the two young men. Garland had appraised them accurately. They wore well-fitting suits and open shirts. The taller one had a close-clipped beard, dark and sleek, promising and intelligent. The other, of medium height, but with broad shoulders, looked powerfully muscled. Undoubtedly undergraduates of Ellaby College. Fine prospects, both of them. "Good evening, gentlemen." Claudia gave them her personal, hospitable smile. "Good evening, ma'am," said the dark one, like a spokesman. He would be for Garland, thought Claudia, for the other, the sturdy one, for her. "Well," said the tall one, "well, we thought—" He paused abassedly. "We thought we'd come walking this way," spoke up the other. "My name's Guy, and this is Larry. We're We're students. Freshmen, added Larry. We go where I'll be. I see, Claudia soothed them. Well, won't you come in? Yes, ma'am, said Guy gratefully. They entered together and stood side by side. Their smiles were diffident. Claudia closed the door behind them. Larry studied the parlour with politely curious eyes. This is a great place. Yeah, wonderful. It's well, nostalgic. Thank you, Dalton smiled to him. Come sit here and see if this couch wasn't more or less made for you. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he paced towards the couch. He wore handsome, shiny boots. He and Garland sat down together, and Claudia held out her hand to Guy. You look like somebody I used to know, she said, slitting her silvery eyes at him. He played football at State. He came visiting here. Maybe all football players look alike, Guy smiled back. I came to Ellerby to play tight end if I can make it. Beside Larry on the couch, Garland turned on her personality. It was as if she'd pressed a button to set it free. Would you like a glass of this port? She asked. It's very good. Let me do it. He took the bottle and poured. His hand trembled just a trifle. Here, and he held out the glass. No, it's for you, she said. I'll wait until later. Larry sipped. Delicious. Yes, only the best for our friends. We surely appreciate this, ma'am, he said, sipping again. You may call me Garland. Claudia had seated Guy in a heavily soft armchair and had perched herself on its arm. They were whispering and chuckling together. Larry, said Garland, you look at me as if you've been around a lot. Maybe my looks are deceptive, he said, brown eyes upon it. I've never been at a place like this before. Garland edged closer to him. Tell me a little about yourself. Oh, I'm just a freshman at Ellerby. Nothing very exciting about that. But it must be. She edged even closer. Just being on campus must be exciting. Come on, tell me more. She put her hand in his. He took it in his warm clasp. Well, freshman year is rough. He seemed to have difficulty talking. There's no hazing at Ellerby anymore, not exactly, but you have to take a lot of stuff to get ready to be a sophomore. She pulled his young arm around her shoulder and began to count the fingers on his hand with delicate little taps. Across the room, Claudia was sitting on Guy's lap, pulling his ear. They seemed to have come to good terms. This is a really great house, Larry said slowly. It's nice, he said. And right here it would come, Garland thought, something about how she was too lovely a girl to be in such a sordid business. Sordid business. To her relief, he didn't say it. Again, she must take the initiative. She pulled his hand to where it could envelop her soft breast and held it there. Like it, she whispered. He must know what was coming, but plainly he was drowned in all sorts of conflicting emotions. Uncle Whit hadn't coached him, not nearly enough. He looked around the lamplit room with his eyes that were somehow plaintive. His beard seemed to droop. All right, Larry, said Garland, come with me. She got up and tugged his hand to make him get to his feet. He smiled. Of course, get him somewhere away from Claudia and Guy. They are so cosy in the armchair. She picked up a lamp and led him into the hall. Wow, he said, that staircase. Spiral. Looks like something in a historical movie. Does it? The staircase wound up into dark reaches. Gently Garland guided him, and he seemed to be glad to be guided. She shepherded him past the torn spots in the carpeting, away from the shaky stretch of the balustrade, up to the hall above. She held up the lamp. It showed the faded roses on the carpet. Here, she said. This is my room. She opened the heavy door and pushed it inward. They stepped across the threshold together, and she set the lamp on a table near the oriel window. I swear, Garland, he muttered, this is great. That old four-poster, bed, the bench, they must be worth a lot. They're old. Older than I am, she smiled at him. You're not old, Garland. You're beautiful. So are you, she told him truthfully. They sat down on the bed. He had a cover of deep blue velvet with dim gold tassels. Larry seemed overwhelmed. I can't tell you how lovely all this is, he stammered. Then don't try. Put your feet up, that's right. Now relax. He sank back. She pulled the loose shirt collar wider. What a beautiful neck you have. Oh, he said, it's Guy who's got the neck. All those exercises, those weights he lifts. Let Claudia attend to Guy. You're here with me. Outside the door, a soft rustling. Garland paid no attention. Larry was quiet now, his eyes closed. Garland bent to him, their tender fingers massaging his temples, his neck. He breathed rhythmically as though he slept. Closer, Garland bent to him, her eyes on his neck, her hands on his neck. Her fingers crooked, their tips pressed. The lamplight shone on her red lips. They parted. Her teeth showed, long and sharp. She crooned to him. She stopped. Her mouth opened above his neck. Outside, voices spoke, faint, inhuman. Garland rose quickly and went to the door. She opened it a crack. Shapes hung there, gaunt and in ragged clothes. "Well?" she whispered fiercely. "Can't you wait?" "Let me in," said one of them. Eyes gleamed palely. "Let me in," said another. "Hungry, hungry." "Can't you wait?" asked Garland again. "After I'm finished, you can have him. Well, you can have what's left." She closed the door on their pleas and hurried back to where Larry lay ready, motionless, dreaming, on the bed. That's the end of that one. So I will now take a quick break, have another go at trying to get the bot to work, and I'll be back in 5 minutes or so to do the much longer story after this, which is the Labyrinth. So hydrate, take a stretch, do anything else you need to do, and I'll be back shortly. Hi, and I'm back. As is Dracubot, who apparently, if I want to be able to connect the bot to the chat, I need to have the window with the bot in a position where I can actually see the thing that you click to connect, which is a tiny, tiny button, at the very bottom of the screen, which I apparently missed. But yes, Dracubot is back and can be summoned to give you content warnings whenever you wish, or at some point I will look into making him randomly generate Dracula quotes, but that probably involves some sort of programming. So, the last story of the evening will be R Chetwynd Hayes' The Labyrinth. In 1988, Ronald Chetwynd Hayes was awarded both the Horror Writers of America and the British Fantasy Special Awards for his services to the field. I realised I put my microphone further away from me. There we go. Since 1973, he has edited some 33 anthologies, including 12 volumes of the Fontana Book of Great Ghost Stories. Published 19 short story collections, 2 movie novelizations and 9 novels. The latest of which are The Curse of the Snake God and Keppel. 2 films have also been based on his work, From Beyond the Grave and The Monster Club. Recent short stories have appeared in After Hours, Skeleton Crew, Fantasy Tales, The Mammoth Book of Terror, and Dark Voices 4, The Pan Book of Horror. Me and vampires have always got on well together, explains the author, and to prove it, here's a somewhat unusual twist on the theme. They were lost. Rosemary knew it and said so in forcible language. Brian also was well aware of their predicament, but was unwilling to admit it. "One cannot be lost in England," he stated. "We're bound to strike a main road if we walk in a straight line." "But suppose we wander in a circle," Rosemary asked, looking fearfully around at the Dartmoor landscape, "and finish up in a bog?" "If we use our eyes, there's no reason why bog should bother us. Come on and stop moaning." "We should never have left that track," Rosemary insisted. "Suppose we get caught out here when night falls?" "Don't be daft," he snapped. "It's only midday. We'll be in Princetown long before nightfall." "You hope." She refused to be convinced. "I'm hungry." "So am I." They were walking up a steep incline, but I don't keep on about it. "I'm not keeping on. I'm hungry and I said so. Do you think we'll find a main road soon?" "Over the next rise," he promised. "There's always a main road over the next rise." But he was wrong. When they crested the next rise and looked down, there was only a narrow track which terminated at a tumble-down gate set in a low stone wall. Beyond, like an island girdled by a yellow lake, was a lawn-besieged house. It was built of grey stone and seemed to have been thrown up by the Moors, a great crouching monster that glared out across the countryside with multiple glass eyes. It had a strange look. The chimney stacks might have been jagged splinters of rock that had acquired a rough cylindrical shape after centuries of wind and rain, but the really odd aspect was that the sun appeared to ignore the house. It had baked the lawn to a pale yellow, cracked the paint on an adjacent summer house, but in some inexplicable way seemed to disavow the existence of the great towering mass. "Tea!" exclaimed Rosemary. "What?" "Tea!" she pointed. "The old lady, she's drinking tea." Sure enough, seated by a small table that nestled in the shade of a vast multicoloured umbrella, was a little white-haired old lady taking tea. Brian frowned, for he could not understand why he had not seen her, or at least the umbrella, before, but there she was, a tiny figure in a white dress and a floppy hat, sipping tea and munching sandwiches. He moistened dry lips. "Do you suppose," he asked, "we dare intrude?" "Watch me," Rosemary said, running down the slope towards the gate. "I'd intrude on Dracula himself if he had a decent cup of tea handy." Their feet moved on to a gravel path, and seemed whatever the breeze stirred the sun-warm heather out on the moors did not dare intrude here. There was a strange stillness, a complete absence of sound, save for the crunch of feet on gravel, and this too ceased when they walked onto the parched lawn. The old lady looked up, and a slow smile gradually lit up a benign, wizened little face, while her tiny hands fluttered over the table, setting out 2 cups and saucers, then felt the teapot as though to make sure the contents were hot. "You poor children!" Her voice had that harsh, slightly cracked quality peculiar to some cultured ladies of an advanced age, but the utterance was clear, every word pronounced with precision. "You look so hot and tired." "We're lost," Rosemary announced cheerfully. "We've wandered for miles." "I must apologise for intruding," Brian said, but the old lady waved a teaspoon at him as though to stress the impossibility of intrusion. "My dear young man, please, you are most welcome. I cannot recall when I last entertained a visitor, although I have always hoped someone might pass this way again. The right kind of someone, of course." She appeared to shiver momentarily, or perhaps tremble, for her hands and shoulders shook slightly, and then an expression of polite distress puckered her forehead. "But how thoughtless I am! You are tired, having wandered so many miles, and there are no chairs." She turned her head and called out in a high-pitched, quivering voice, "Carlo! Carlo!" A tall, lean man came out of the house and moved slightly towards them. He was dressed in a black satin tunic and matching trousers, and due possibly to some deformity, appeared to bound over the lawn rather than walk. Brian thought of a wolf, or a large dog that has spotted intruders. He stopped a few feet from the old lady and stood waiting, his slate-coloured eyes watching Rosemary with a strange intensity. "Carlo, you will fetch chairs," the old lady ordered, "and then some more hot water." Carlo made a guttural sound and departed in the direction of the summer house, leaping forward in a kind of loping run. He returned almost immediately, carrying 2 little slatted chairs, and presently Brian and Rosemary were seated under the vast umbrella, drinking tea from delicate china cups, and listening to the harsh, cultivated voice. "I must have lived here alone for such a long time. Gracious me, if I were to tell you how long, you would smile. Time is such an inexhaustible commodity, so long as one can tap the fountainhead. The secret is to break it down into small change. An hour does not seem to be long until you remember it has 3,600 seconds, and a week. My word, did you ever realize you have 604,800 seconds to spend every 7 days? It's an enormous treasure. Do you have another strawberry jam sandwich, child?" Rosemary accepted another triangular, pink-edged sandwich, and then stared open-eyed at the house. At close quarters it looked even more grim than from a distance. There was the impression the walls had drawn from their shadows above themselves like a ghostly cloak, and although the house stood stark and forbidding in broad daylight, it seemed to be divorced from sunshine. Rosemary, of course, made the obvious statement. "It must be very old." "It has lived," the old lady said, "for millions upon millions of seconds. It has drunk deep from the barrel of time." Rosemary giggled, then hastily assumed an extravagantly serious expression as Brian glared at her. He sipped his tea and said, "This is really most kind of you. We were fagged out. We were..." It's a very early term. "And rather scared, too. The moor seemed to go on, and I thought we would have to spend the night out there." The old lady nodded, her gaze flickering from one young face to the other. "It is not pleasant to be lost in a great empty space. Doubtless if you had not returned before nightfall, someone would have instigated a search for you." "Not on your Nelly," Rosemary stated with challenging simplicity. "No one knows where we are. We're taking a sort of roaming holiday." "Jesus, Rosemary, never tell the strange, mysterious old woman that no one's looking for you." "How adventurous," the old lady murmured, and then called back over one shoulder. "Carlo, the hot water man, do hurry." Carlo came bounding out of the house, carrying a silver jug in one hand and a plate of sandwiches in the other. When he reached the table, his mouth was open and he was breathing heavily. The old lady shot him an anxious glance. "Poor old boy," she consoled. "Does the heat get you down then? Does the heat make you puff and pant? Never mind, you can go and lie down somewhere in the shade." She turned to her guests and smiled a most kindly, benign smile. "Carlo has mixed blood, and he finds the heat most trying." Yes, someone clearly has not read enough horror. Mixed blood, that's probably another term we wouldn't use these days. I keep telling him to practice more self-control, but he will insist on running about. She sighed. I suppose it is his nature. Rosemary was staring intently at her lap, and Brian saw an ominous shake of her shoulders, so he hurriedly exclaimed, You really live alone? In that vast house? It looks enormous. Only a small portion, child, she laughed stuffily, a little silvery sound. Huh. You see the windows on the ground floor, which have curtains? That is my little domain. All the rest is closed up. Miles upon miles of empty corridors. Brian re-examined the house with renewed interest. 6 lower windows looked more holes than the others. The frames had, in the not-too-distant past, been painted white, and crisp white curtains gave them a lived-in look. But the panes still seemed reluctant to reflect the sunlight, and he frowned before raising his eyes to the upper stories. 3 rows of dirt-grimed glass. So many eyes from behind which life had long since departed, save possibly for rats and mice. Then he started and gripped his knees with hands that were not quite steady. On the topmost story, at the window third from the left, a face suddenly emerged and pressed its nose flat against the glass. There was no way of telling if the face were young or old, or if it belonged to a man, woman, or child. It was just a white blur, equipped with a pair of blank eyes and a flattened nose. Madam, Brian began, my name, the old lady said gently, is Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown, there's a nice homely name, Mrs. Brown went on. Do you not think so? I feel it goes with a blazing fire, a singing kettle, and muffins for tea. Madam, Mrs. Brown, the window up there. What window, child? Mrs. Brown was examining the interior of the teapot with some concern. There are so many windows. The third from the left. Brian was pointing at the face, which appeared to be opening and shutting its mouth. There's someone up there, and they seem to be in trouble. You're mistaken, my dear, Mrs. Brown shook her head. No one lives up there, and without life there can be no face. That is logic. The face disappeared. It was not so much withdrawn as blotted out, as though the window had suddenly clouded over, and now it was just another dead man's eye staring out over the sun-drenched moors. I could swear there was a face, Brian insisted, and Mrs. Brown smiled. The one with the weird face. I don't know. A cloud reflection. It's so easy to see faces where none exist. A crack in the ceiling, a damp patch in the wall, a puddle in moonlight all become faces when the brain is tired. Can I press you to another cup? No, thank you. Brian rose and nudged Rosemary to do the same. She obeyed with ill grace. If you would be so kind as to direct us to the nearest main road, we will be on our way. I could not possibly do that. Mrs. Brown looked most distressed. We are really miles from anywhere, and you poor children would get hopelessly lost. Really, I must insist you stay here for the night. You're most kind, and don't think us ungrateful, Brian said, but there must be a village not too far away. Oh, Brian, Rosemary clutched his arm, I couldn't bear to wander about there for hours, and suppose the sun sets. I've told you before, we'll be home and dry long before then, he snapped, and Mrs. Brown rose, revealing herself as a figure of medium height, whose bowed shoulders made her shorter than she actually was. She shook a playful finger at the young man. How could you be so ungallant? Can you not see the poor girl is simply dropping from fatigue? She took Rosemary's arm and began to propel her towards the house, still talking in her harsh, precise voice. These big, strong men have no thought for us poor, frail women, have they, my dear? He is a brute. Rosemary made a face at Brian over one shoulder. We wouldn't have got lost if he hadn't made us leave the main track. It is the restless spirit that haunts the best of them, Mrs. Brown confided. They must wander into strange and forbidden places, then come home crying to us when they get hurt. They moved in through the open French windows, leaving the hot summer afternoon behind them, for a soft and clinging coolness leapt to embrace their bodies like a slightly damp sheet. Ugh. Brian shivered, but Rosemary exclaimed, How sweet! She was referring to the room. It was full of furniture, chairs, table, sideboard, from which the sheen of newness had long since departed. The patterned carpet had faded, and so had the wallpaper. A vase of dried flowers stood on the mantelpiece, and from all around, an essential part of the coolness, came a sweet, just perceptible aroma. It was the scent of extreme old age, which is timidly approaching death on faltering feet. For a moment Brian had a mental picture of an open coffin bedecked with sweet dying flowers. Then Mrs. Brown spoke. There are 2 sweet little rooms situated in rear. You will rest well in them. Carlo emerged from somewhere. He was standing by the open doorway, his slate-grey eyes watching Mrs. Brown as she nodded gravely. Go with him, my dears. He will attend to your wants, and presently, when you have rested, we will dine. They followed their strange guide along a gloom-painted passage, and he silently opened 2 doors, motioned Rosemary into one, then, after staring blankly at Brian, pointed to the other. You've been with Mrs. Brown a long time? Brian asked in a loud voice, assuming the man was deaf. Must be rather lonely for you here. Carlo did not answer. and he turned on his heel and went back along the passage with that strange loping walk. Rosemary giggled. Honestly, did you ever see anything like it? Only in a horror film, Brian admitted. Say, do you suppose he's deaf and dumb? Fairly obviously, Rosemary shrugged. Let's have a look at our rooms. They were identical. Each held a four-post bed, a Tudor-style chest of drawers, and a bedside cupboard. The same faint odour prevailed here, but Rosemary did not seem to notice it. Do you suppose this place wants a bath? She said, seating herself on Brian's bed. Before he could answer, Carlo's lean form filled the doorway, and he made a guttural sound while beckoning them to follow him. He led the way down the passage, and at the very end opened a door and motioned them to enter the room beyond. It was empty save for a very ancient hip bath, and 6 leather buckets lined up against one wall. They began to laugh, clinging to each other for support. Their silent guide watched them with an expressionless stare. Brian was the first to regain his speech. Ask a silly question, he gasped, and you'll get a ridiculous answer. I rarely eat. Mrs. Brown was sipping daintily from a glass of mineral water and watching the young people with lively interest as they consumed large steak and a generous helping of fresh salad. When you are my age, she went on, one's fires need little fuel, a sip of water, an occasional nibble, the odd crumb. When you must eat, Rosemary looked at the old lady with some concern. I mean, you have to. Child, Mrs. Brown beckoned to Carlo, who started to collect the empty plates. Food is not necessarily meat and vegetables. Passion will feed the soul and nourish the body. I recommend love as an hors d'oeuvre, hate as the entree, and fear as a chilly dessert. Rosemary looked nervously at Brian and then took a long drink of water to hide her confusion. The young man decided to bring the conversation back to a more mundane plane. I am most interested in your house, Mrs. Brown. It seems a shame that so little of it is used. I did not say it was not used, dear, Mrs. Brown corrected genteelly. I said no one lived in the region that lies outside this apartment. There is, I am sure you would agree, a difference. Carlo returned, carrying a dish of large pink blancmange. This he deposited on the table, after giving the girl and the young man a long, expressionless stare. You must forgive Carlo, Mrs. Brown said, as she carved the blancmange into thin slices. There is some time since we entertained guests, and he is apt to stare at that which he is not allowed to touch. Brian nudged Rosemary, who was watching the blancmange carving with undisguised astonishment. Mrs. Brown, you say the rest of the house is used but not lived in? I'm sorry, but does anyone live in your stomach? Mrs. Brown asked quietly. He laughed, but seeing no smile on the wrinkled face opposite, quickly assumed a serious expression. No, of course not. But it is used, Mrs. Brown persisted. He nodded. Yes, indeed. Quite a lot. So with the house. She handed Rosemary a plate that contained 3 thin slices of pink blancmange, and the girl said, Thank you. In a strangled voice, You see, the house does not require people to live in it, for the simple reason that it is in itself a living organism. Brian frowned as he accepted his plate of sliced blancmange. Why not? The old lady appeared surprised that her word should be doubted. Do you begrudge your house life? They both shook their heads violently, and Mrs. Brown appeared satisfied with their apparent acquiescence. After all, in ordinary houses, what are passages? I will tell you. Intestines, bowels, if you wish, and the boiler, which pumps hot water throughout the body of the house, a heart. What else could it be? In the same way, that mass of pipes and cisterns that were lied up in the loft, what are they, if not a brain? You have a point, Brian agreed. Of course I have. Mrs. Brown deposited another slice of blancmange on Rosemary's plate. But of course, I was referring to ordinary houses. And this is not an ordinary house by any means. It really lives. I would certainly like to meet the builder, Brian said caustically. He must have been a remarkable chap. Builder? When did I mention a builder? My dear young man, the house was not built. It grew. Nutty as a fruitcake. Rosemary spoke with a strong conviction while she sat on Brian's bed. True, Brian nodded, but the idea is rather fascinating. Oh, come off it. How can a house grow? And from what? A brick? Oh, wait a minute. In a way, a house does grow. It is fathered by an architect and mothered by a builder. That's all very well, Rosemary complained, but that old sausage-bent damn thing grew like a tree. Frankly, she gives me the willies. You know something? I think she's laughing at us. I mean to say, all that business of carving the blancmange into thin slices. A house is an extension of a man's personality, Brian was thinking out loud. In its early life, it would be innocent, like a newborn baby. But after it had been lived in a bit... He paused. Then the house would take on an atmosphere. Would even be haunted. Oh, shut up, Rosemary shivered. I'm expected to sleep here tonight. In any case, as I keep saying, the old thing maintains the house grew. Even that makes a mad kind of logic, he grinned, mocking what he assumed to be her pretended fear. We must reverse the process. The atmosphere came first, and the house second. I'm going to bed. She got up and sauntered to the door. If you hear me scream during the night, come a-running. Why bother to go? Brian asked slyly. If you stay here, I won't have to run anywhere. Ha ha, funny man. Not in this morgue. She smiled impishly from the doorway. I'd be imagining all manner of things looking down at me from the ceiling. Do not bang in the crazy house. Do not bang in the haunted house with the scary lady who slices blancmange into very, very thin slices. How do you eat blancmange? I think you take a big chunk out of it, to be honest. It's been a while. Brian lay in his four-poster bed and listened to the house preparing for sleep. Woodwork contracted as the temperature dropped. Floorboards creaked. Window frames made little rattling noises. Somewhere a door closed. Sleep began to dull his senses, and he became only half aware of his surroundings. He was poised on the brink of oblivion. Then, as though a bomb had exploded, he was blasted back into full consciousness. Long, drawn-out moan had shattered the silence and was coming at him from all directions. He sat up and looked around the room. So far as he could see by the light of the rising moon that filtered through his lace curtains, the room was empty. Suddenly the groan was repeated. He sprang out of bed, lit his candle, and looked wildly around him. The sand was everywhere, in the walls with their faded pink rose wallpaper, in the cracked ceiling and the threadbare carpet. He covered his ears with shaking hands, but still the mournful groan continued, invading his brain, seeping down into his very being until it seemed the entire universe was crying out in anguish. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ceased. A heavy, unnatural silence descended on the house like a great enveloping blanket. Brian hastily scrambled into his clothes. Enough is enough, he spoke aloud. We're getting out. Fast. Another sound came into being. It began a long way off, a slow, hesitant footstep, married to squeaking floorboards, and a laborious picking up and putting down of naked feet, interspersed with a slow slithering which suggested the unseen walker was burdened with the tiredness of centuries. This time there was no doubt as to where the sound was coming from. It was up above. The soft padding steps passed over the ceiling, and once again the house groaned, but now it was a moan of ecstasy, a low cry of fulfillment. Brian opened the bedroom door and crept out into the corridor. The moaning cry and the slithering footsteps merged and became a nightmarish sympathy, a two-toned serenade of horror. Then again all sound ceased, and the silence was like a landmine that might explode at any moment. He found himself waiting for the moan, the slithering overhead footsteps to begin all over again, or perhaps something else, something that defied imagination. He tapped on Rosemary's door, then turned the handle and entered, holding his candle high and calling her name. Rosemary, wake up, Rosemary. Come on, we're getting out of here. The flickering candle flame made great shadows leap across the wall and dance over the ceiling. It cut ragged channels through the darkness until at last his questing eye saw the bed. It was empty. The sheets and blankets were twisted up into loose ropes, and a pillow lay upon the floor. Rosemary! He whispered her name, and the house chuckled. A low, harsh, gurgling laugh that made him run from the room, raced down the long corridor until he lurched into the dining room. An old-fashioned oil lamp stood on the table, illuminating the room with a pale orange light and revealing Mrs. Brown seated in an armchair, calmly darning a sock. She looked up as Brian entered and smiled like a mother whose small son has strayed from his warm bed on a winter's night. I would put the candle down, dear, she said, otherwise you will spill grease all over the carpet. Rosemary, he shouted, where is she? There's really no need for you to shout. Despite my advanced years, I am not deaf. She broke the wall and then turned the sock and examined her work with a certain pride. That's better. Carlo was so hard on his socks. She looked up with a sly smile. It is only to be expected, of course. He has hard feet. Where is she? Brian set down the candle and moved closer to the old woman, who was now closing her work basket. She's not in her room, and there are signs of a struggle. What have you done with her? Mrs. Brown shook her head sadly. Questions, questions. How hungry youth is for knowledge. You demand to know the truth, and should I gratify your desire, how distressed you would become. Ignorance is a gift freely offered by the gods, and so often it is spurned by misguided mortals. Even I sometimes wish I knew less, but... Her sigh was one of sad resignation. Time reveals all to those who live long enough. I should go back to bed, dear. The young need their sleep. Brian advanced a few steps and spoke in carefully controlled voice. I'm going to ask you for the last time, Mrs. Brown, or whatever your name is, what have you done with Rosemary? She looked up and shook her head in sad reproof. Threats? How unwise. A sparrow should never threaten an eagle. It is so futile and such a waste of time. Mrs. Brown carefully placed her work-basket on the floor, then snapped in a surprisingly firm voice, Carlo! There came from somewhere to Brian's rear a low, deep growl. She is indeed being digested by the house. Such a menacing sound might have issued from the throat of a large dog whose mistress has been threatened, or a she-wolf protecting her young. But when the young man spun round, he saw Carlo standing a few feet away. The man had his head tilted to one side, and his large yellow teeth were bared as he growled again. His stance was grotesque. He was leaning forward slightly as though preparing to spring, and his fingers were curved so that with their long pointed nails they looked uncannily like talons. His cheeks seemed to have shrunk, and his black hair lay over his narrow skull like a sleek ebony mane. "Will you believe me?" Mrs. Brown said, and her voice was less harsh, much younger. "I have only to say one word, and your windpipe will be hanging down your shirt front." "You are mad." Brian backed away slowly, and Carlo moved forward, matching him step for step. "You are both mad." "You mean," Mrs. Brown came round and joined Carlo, "we are not normal by your standards, and that much I grant you. Sanity is only a form of madness favoured by the majority. But I think the time has come for you to meet Truth, since you are so eager to make her acquaintance." "I only want to find Rosemary and then get out of here," Brian said. "Find your little friend, perhaps. Leave here. Ah," Mrs. Brown looked thoughtful. "That is another matter. But come, there is much for you to see, and please, no heroics. Carlo is on the turn. He is apt to be a little touchy when the moon is full." They filed out into the hall, Mrs. Brown leading the way with Brian following, and the grim Carlo bringing up the rear. To the right of a great staircase was a black door, and to this Mrs. Brown unlocked, then entered the room beyond, where she proceeded to light a lamp from Brian's candle. The light crept outwards in ever-increasing circles, and she turned up the wick, revealing oak-panelled walls and a cobweb-festooned ceiling. The room was bare, except for the portrait hanging over a dirt-grimed marble fireplace. To this the young man's eyes were drawn like a pin to a magnet. The background was jet black, and the face corpse-white. The large black eyes glared in intense hatred for all living things, and the thin-lipped mouth was shut tight, but so cunningly had the portrait been painted that Brian had the feeling it might open at any moment. "My late husband," Mrs. Brown stated, "was a partaker of blood." "It must be the best part of 500 years since they came down from the village," Mrs. Brown continued. "Chanting priests looking like black ravens, mewing peasants huddled together like frightened sheep. I recall it was night, and the mist shrouded the moors and swirled about their thrice-accursed cross as though it wished to protect us from the menace it represented." She paused, and Brian realised she looked much younger. The face was filling out. The shoulders were no longer bowed. "They did not consider I was of great importance," Mrs. Brown went on, "so I was merely tied to a tree and flogged, thereby preventing entertainment for the herd of human cattle who liked nothing better than to see a woman writhe under the lash. But it was rather, yes, a taker of blood. But him they dug a hole and laid flat, having bound his body in cords that were sealed with the dreaded sign. Then they drove a stake through his heart. Fools." She glared at Brian and clenched her small fists. "They left it for dead. Dead. His brain still lived. The blood was only symbolic. It was the vital essence we needed. Still need. The force that makes the soul reach out for the stars. The hammer that can create beauty out of black depravity." She went over to the portrait and stroked the white, cruel face with hands that had become long and slender. "When they buried his beautiful body, they planted a seed, and from that seed grew the house, a projection of himself." "I don't believe you," Brian shook his head. "I won't. I can't believe you." "No," she laughed, and Carlo howled. "Then feel the walls. They are warm, flesh of his flesh, moist. The body fluids seep out when he is aroused. Look." She pointed to a great double door set in one wall. "Look, the mouth. When I open the lips, food pops in. Succulent, living food, and we all benefit. I, Carlo, who sprang from the old people, I still let him roam the moors when the moon is full. And of course he, the house. He needs all the sweet essence he can get. He sleeps after meat and no longer moans. I do not like to hear him moan." "Where is Rosemary?" Brian asked again, and knew what must follow. "She passed through the lips an hour since." Mrs. Brown laughed very softly, and Carlo made a whining sound. "Now, if you would find her, there is not really much alternative. You must follow her through the great intestines, down into the mighty bowels. Wander and cry out, trudge on and on until at last your will is broken, and he can take from you what he needs." "You want me to go through those doors?" Brian asked, and there was a glimmer of hope. "And go wandering through the corridors of an empty house? When I find Rosemary, we will break out." The woman smiled as she motioned to Carlo. "Part to the lips, Carlo." The man, indeed that which crept forward was a man, silently obeyed. The great doors groaned as they swung inwards, and Brian saw a murky passage lined with green-tinted walls. A warm, sweet, cloying odour made his stomach heave, and he drew back. "She's waiting for you," Mrs. Brown said softly, "and she must be very frightened wandering through the labyrinth. Not exactly alone, but I doubt if she will appreciate the company. Most of them will be well digested by now." Carlo was waiting, his hand on the handle of one door. His eyes were those of a hungry wolf who sees his prey about to be devoured by a lion. Brian, without a sideways glance, passed through the entrance and the door slammed to behind him. There were no stairs. The corridors sometimes sloped upward. At others they spiralled downwards. There were stretches when the floor was comparatively level. But the corridors were never straight for long. They twisted, crossed other passages, suddenly split, leaving the wanderer with the choice of 3 or more openings. Occasionally they came to a blank end, forcing him to retrace his footsteps. Light was provided by an eerie greenish glow radiating from the walls and ceiling, and sometimes this light pulsated, suggesting it originated from some form of decay. Brian stumbled onwards, shouting Rosemary's name, and his echo mocked him, went racing on ahead until it became a faraway voice calling back along the avenues of time. Once he stumbled and fell against the wall. Instantly the moist green surface contracted under his weight, and there was an obscene sucking sound when he pulled himself free. Yeah. A portion of his shirt sleeve remained stuck to the wall, and there was a red mark on his arm. When he had been walking for some 30 minutes, he came upon the window passage. There was no other word to describe it, for one wall was lined with windows, each one set about 6 feet apart, and he gave a little cry of joy, certain this was the place from which he and Rosemary could make their escape. Then he saw them. Before each window stood one, occasionally 2 forms, hideously thin, scarecrow figures that pawed at the window panes with claw-like fingers and emitted little animal whimpers. Brian approached the first window and gave a quick glance through the grimy panes. He was 2 floors, if that was the right expression, up, and he saw the lawn then, further out, the moors all bathed in brilliant moonlight. Even as he watched, a great hound went bounding across the lawn. It cleared the low wall in a single leap and then streaked out across the moors. Something touched Brian's arm, and he spun round to face one of the creatures that had silently crept along from the next window. He saw at close quarters the skeleton face covered with brown, wrinkled skin and the vacant blue eyes that stared up at him with mute, suffering appeal. He judged the man to have been a tramp, or possibly a gypsy, for he wore the remnants of a red shirt and brown corduroy trousers. The claw hands plucked feebly at his arm, and the mouth opened, revealing toothless gums, and a hoarse whisper seeped out. "The old cow said come in." "How long have you been here?" Brian asked, uncomfortably aware that a number of other grotesque bundles of rag and bones were leaving their posts by the windows and slithering on naked feet towards him. The whisper came in again. "The old cow said come in." "Have you seen a young girl?" Brian shouted. "Have any of you seen a girl?" The man tried to grip his arm, but there was no strength left in the wasted frame, and he could only repeat the single phrase. "The old cow said come in." They were all clustered around him. 3 bore some resemblance to women, although their hair had fallen out, and one, a tall beanstalk of a creature, kept mumbling, "Pretty boy," while she tried unsuccessfully to fasten her gums into his neck. "Break the windows!" Brian shouted, pushing them away as gently as he could. "Listen, break the windows, then I'll be able to climb down and fetch help." "The old cow said come in." The man could only repeat over and over the 6 ominous words, and a wizened, awful thing no higher than a child kept muttering, "Eat," as it tried to fasten his mouth on Brian's right hand. Unreasoning terror made him strike the creature full in the face, and it went crashing back against the wall. Instantly the green surface bent inwards, and a deep sigh ran through the house, making the ghastly pack go slithering along the corridor, their remaining spark of intelligence having presumably warned them this sound was something to be feared. The small, child-sized figure was left stuck to the wall like a fly on gum paper as the green light pulsated. The creature jerked in unison. Brian pulled off one of his shoes and smashed the heel against the nearest window pane. He might as well have struck a slab of solid rock for all the impression he made, and at last he gave up and continued to search for Rosemary. After an hour of trudging wearily through green-tinted pastures, he had no idea how far he had travelled, or if indeed he was just going round in a perpetual circle. He found himself dragging his feet, making the same hesitant, slithering footsteps that had so alarmed him in his bedroom centuries ago. The corridors were never silent, for there were always cries, usually some way off, and a strange thudding sound which came into being when the green light pulsated. But these off-stage noises became as murmur when the scream rang out. It was a cry of despair, a call for help, a fear-born prayer, and at once Brian knew who had screamed. He shouted Rosemary's name as he broke into a run, terrified lest he'd been unable to reach her, and at the same time in dread of what he might find. Had she not screamed again, he would doubtless have taken the wrong passage, but when the second shriek rang out, he ran towards the sound and presently came to a kind of circular hall. They were clinging to her like leeches to a drowning horse. Their skeleton hands were tearing her dress, their toothless mouths fouled her flesh, and all the while they squealed like a herd of hungry pigs. He pulled them away, and their soulless bodies went hurtling back against vibrating walls. Bones snapped like frost-crisp twigs, and despairing whimpers rose to an unholy chorus. He took Rosemary in his arms as she clung to him as though he were life itself, clutching his shoulders in a terrified grip while she cried like a lost child. He murmured soft, unintelligible words, trying to reassure himself as much as her, and then screamed at the pack, who were again slowly moving in. "Don't you understand? This is not real. It's the projection of a mad brain. A crazy nightmare. Try to find a way out." It is doubtful if they heard, let alone understood, what he was saying, and those who could still move were still edging their way forward like rats whose hunger is greater than their fear. "Can you walk?" he asked Rosemary, and the girl nodded. "Good. Then we must make our way downwards. The woman's apartment is on the ground floor, and our only hope is to batter those doors down and escape across the lawn." "It's impossible." Rosemary was clinging to his arm, and they were leaving the creatures behind. "This place is a labyrinth. We will wander round and round these corridors until we drop." "Nonsense," he spoke sharply. "The house can't be all that big, and we are young and fit. So long as we go down, we're bound to find the doors." This was easier said than done. Many corridors sloped down, only to start up again, but presently they came out to a window passage and found they were somewhere at the rear of the house, but only one floor up. "Now," Brian kissed Rosemary, "only one more slope to go, and we're there." "We're the wrong side of the house," Rosemary complained, "and even if we find the doors, how are you going to break through them?" "One step at a time. Let's find them first, and then maybe I'll use you as a battering ram." "Oh wait, lad." It took an hour to find the next downward slope, and then only after they had retraced their steps several times. But at last they were moving downwards. Rosemary shivered. "It's getting colder." "Yes, and that damned stink is becoming more pronounced. But never mind, we'll soon be there." They went steadily downwards for another 5 minutes, and then Rosemary began to cry. "Brian, I can't go on much longer. Surely we've passed the ground floor ages ago. And there's something awful down here. I can feel it." "It can't be more awful than what's up above," he retorted grimly. "We must go on. There's no turning back unless you want to finish up a zombie." "Zombie?" she repeated dully. "What did you imagine those things were back there? They died long ago, and they only keep going because the house gives them a sort of half-life. Mrs. Brown and Carlo seem to be better provided for, but they died centuries ago." "I can't believe all this," Rosemary shuddered. "How can a place like this exist in the 20th century?" "It doesn't. I should imagine we'd stumble across the house at the right, in our case the wrong time. I suppose you might call it a time trap." "I don't know what you're talking about," Rosemary said, then added, "I very rarely do." The passage was becoming steeper, spiralling round and sloping down until they had difficulty in remaining upright. Then the floor levelled out, and after a space of about 6 feet came to an end. "Earth," Brian felt the termination wall. "Good, honest earth." "Earth," Rosemary repeated. "So what?" Brian raised his eyes ceilingward and then spoke in a carefully controlled voice. "So far we've been walking on a floor, and between walls that are constructed of something very nasty, right? Now we are facing a wall built or shoveled into place. I don't care. Of plain down-to-earth earth. Got it?" Rosemary nodded. "Yes, so we've got down to the house foundations, but I thought we were looking for the doors." Brian gripped her shoulders. "Say that again?" "Say what again? Look, you're hurting me." He shook her gently. "The first bit." She thought for a moment. "So we've got down to the house foundations. What's so important about that?" He released her and went up close to the wall, where he stood for a few minutes examining its surface. Then he came back and tilted her chin up so she was looking directly into his eyes. "Will you try to be very, very brave?" Fear came rushing back, and she shivered. "Why?" "Because I'm going to break down that wall," he spoke very slowly, "and on the other side we may find something very nasty indeed." She did not move her head, only continued to gaze up into his eyes. "Isn't there any other way?" she whispered. He shook his head. "None. None whatsoever." There was a minute of complete silence then. "What are you going to use as a shovel?" He laughed and went back to the wall, which he pounded with his fist. "I could say you have a point there, but I won't. Let's take an inventory. What have we that is pick and shovel worthy? Our hands, of course. Shoes, maybe." He felt in his pocket and produced a bunch of keys and a penknife. "This might start things going. Then we can pull the loose stuff out with my hands." He sank the penknife blade into the soft, moist earth and traced a rough outline of a door, and then began to deepen the edges, digging out little lumps of earth that fell to the ground like gobbets of chewed meat. Brian then removed his shoes and used the heels to claw out a jagged hole. If I can work my way through, he explained, it should be an easy matter to pull the whole thing down. He dug steadily for another 5 minutes, and then a glimmer of light appeared, and after a final effort he was able to look through an opening roughly 6 inches in diameter. "What can you see?" Rosemary asked, her tone suggesting she would rather not know. "It seems to be some kind of large cave, and it's lit up with that green light, just like the passages. I can see hunks of rock lying about, but not much else. Well, here goes." He thrust his right hand through the aperture, curled his fingers around the inner wall, and pulled. A large chunk came away, then he began to work with both hands, pulling and clawing, and the entire wall came tumbling down. He wiped his hands on his already stained trousers, then put on his shoes. "Now," he said, "for the moment of truth." They were in a rough, circular cavern. It was perhaps 20 feet in diameter and an equal distance in height. Loose lumps of rock littered the floor, and there was no sign of anyone, alive or dead, and Brian gave a prolonged sigh of relief. "I don't know what I expected to see, but thank heavens I don't see it. Now we must start looking for a way out. I'll go round the walls, you examine the floor. Never know, there might be a hole down going somewhere still further." He turned his attention to the irregular walls, leaving Rosemary to wander miserably around the large rocks and boulders that formed a kind of fence around the centre of the cavern. He looked upwards and saw some 20 feet from the ground a fairly large hole. Deciding it would be worth investigating, he began to ascend the wall and found the task easier than he had supposed, for projecting rocks made excellent footholds. In a few minutes he had reached his objective. The hole was in fact a small cave that was about 7 feet high and 5 across, but alas, there was no exit. He was about to descend and continue his search elsewhere when Rosemary screamed. Never before had he realised a human throat was capable of expressing such abject terror. Shriek after shriek rang out and re-echoed against the walls, until it seemed an army of banshees were forecasting 1,000,000 deaths. He looked down and saw the girl standing just inside the fence of stones, looking down at something he could not see. Her eyes were dilated and seemed frozen into an expression of indescribable horror. Brian scrambled down the wall and over to her. When he laid hands on her shoulders, she flinched as though his touch were a branding iron. Then her final shriek was cut off, and she slid silently to the floor. A few feet away there was a slight indentation, a shallow hole, and he experienced a terrifying urge not to look into it, but he knew he must, if for no other reason than a strange, compelling curiosity. He dragged Rosemary well back and left her lying against one wall. Then he returned, creeping forward very slowly, walking on tiptoe. At last he was on the brink of hell. He looked down. Horror ran up his body in cold waves. It left an icy lump in his stomach, and he wanted to be sick, only he had not the strength. He had to stare down, concentrate all his senses, and try to believe. The head bore a resemblance to the portrait in Mrs. Brown's anteroom. It was dead white, bloated, suggesting an excess of nourishment consumed over a very long period. The hair was at least 6 feet in length, and was spread out over the loose rock like a monstrous shroud. But the torso and the arms grew out of the ground. The shoulders and part of the forearms were flesh, but further down the white skin assumed a greyish colour, and lower still gradually merged into the solid rock. Most horrifying of all was the profusion of fat, greenish, tube-like growths that sprouted out from under forearms and neck, and so far as Brian could see, the whole of the back. Obscene roots, spreading out in every direction until they disappeared into the black earth, writhing and pulsating, carrying the vital fluid that circulated around the house. The eyes were closed, but the face moved. The thin lips grimaced, creating temporary furrows in the flabby fat. Brian withdrew from the hole, the grave, and at last his stomach had its way and allowed him to be violently sick. By the time he returned to Rosemary, he felt old and drained of strength. She was just returning to consciousness, and he smoothed back her hair. "Are you fit enough to talk?" he asked. She gave a little strangled gasp. That thing!" "Yes, I know. Now listen. I'm going to take you up there." He pointed to the cave set high in the opposite wall. "You'll be all right there while I do what must be done." Brian's a pretty competent lad, to be honest. He'd probably make a good monster hunter. "I don't understand," she shook her head. "What must you do?" "Mrs. Brown told me her husband was a partaker of blood. In other words, a vampire. And centuries ago the local lads did the traditional thing, and drove a stake through his heart. She said something else. It wasn't his body they should have destroyed, but his brain. Don't you see, the house, the entire setup, is a nightmare produced by a monstrous intelligence." "I'll believe anything." Rosemary got to her feet. "Just get me out of here. I'd rather walk the passages than spend another minute with that thing." "No," he shook his head. "I must destroy the brain. The only point is, when I do..." He looked around the cavern, then over the entrance to the green-walled passage. "Anything may happen." "What about you?" she asked. "So soon as the job is finished, I'll join you." He might have added, if I can, but instead guided Rosemary to the wall and assisted her up to the cave. Now, he instructed, stay well back and don't in any circumstances so much as put your nose outside. Understand? God, I'm petrified, she said. Don't let it get around, he nodded grimly, but so am I. Manly. He came back to the hole like a released spirit returning to hell. As he drew nearer, the terror grew until it required a desperate effort to raise one foot and put it down before the other. Only the memory of Rosemary up there in the cave kept his spark of courage alive. At last he again gazed down to that horrible growth. It groaned, and the sound raced around the cavern and up through the house. The face grimaced and twitched, while the green tubes writhed like a nest of gorged worms. Brian selected a rock which was a little larger than the bloated head, and gripping it in both hands, prepared to hurl it down. He had tensed his muscles and was turning slightly to one side when the eyelids flicked back, and he was staring into two pools of black hate. The shock was so intense he automatically slackened his grip, and the rock slid from his fingers and went crashing down somewhere behind him. The mouth opened and a vibrant whisper went racing up through the house. Elizabeth! Carlo! The words came out slowly like a series of intelligible sighs, but from all around, from the walls, the floor, the high roof, never from the moving lips. Would you destroy that which you do not understand? Brian was fumbling for the rock, but he paused and the whispering voice went on. I must continue to be. I must grow. Fill the universe. Consume. Take strength. A padding of fast-running paws came from the passage entrance, and a woman's voice was calling out. Petros, drink of his essence. Will him into walking death. There was a hint of fear in the terrible eyes. The whispering voice again ran through the house. He is an unbeliever. He is the young of a new age. Why did you let him through? The great dog leapt over the loose earth and emerged from the passageway. It was as black as midnight, like a solid shadow newly escaped from a wall, and it padded round the cavern before jumping onto a boulder and preparing to leap. Brian hurled a rock at it and struck the broad black snout. Rolling well on his attack roll there. The beast howled and fell back as Mrs. Brown spoke from the entrance. You will not keep that up for long. Carlo cannot be killed by the likes of you. She had been transformed. The once white hair was now a rich auburn, the face as young as today, but the glorious eyes reflected the evil of a million yesterdays. Mine when the deer kicks you in the head because you take a bite again. yeah, legit. This prey is fighty backy. Monkeys and rocks. Just monkeys and shoes, which we used to dig through walls. The glorious eyes reflected the eve of a million yesterdays. She wore a black evening dress that left her arms and back bare. Just dressed for dinner, I guess. And Brian could only stare at her, forgetting all that lay behind him and Rosemary up in the cave. All he could see was white flesh and inviting eyes. Come away, the low, husky voice said. Leave Petros to his dream. He cannot harm you, and it would be such a waste if Carlo were to rip your nice body to shreds. Think of what I can offer. An eternity of bliss. 1,000,000 lifetimes of pleasure. Come. He took one step forward, then another, and it seemed he was walking into a forbidden dream. All the secret desires that up to that point he had not realized existed flared up and became exciting possibilities. Then, just as he was about to surrender, go running to her like a child to a beautiful toy, her voice lashed across his consciousness. Carlo, now! The dog came snarling over the rocks, and Brian fell back, suddenly fully aware of the pending danger. He snatched up a piece of jagged rock and threw it at the oncoming beast. He hit it just above the right ear, and then began to hurl stones as fast as he could pick them up. The dog leapt from side to side, snarling with pain and rage. But Brian realised it was coming forward more than it retreated, and knew a few minutes, at the most, must elapse before he felt those fangs at his throat. By chance his hand closed around the original small boulder. It was then that he understood what must be done. He raised the rock above his head, made as though to hurl it at the dog, which momentarily recoiled, then threw it back, straight at the head of Petros. The house shrieked. One long, drawn-out scream, and the dog was no longer there. Instead, Carlo ran towards his mistress, making plaintive, guttural cries, before sinking down before her, plucking frantically at the hem of her black dress. Brian looked back and down into the hole and saw the head was shattered, and what remained of the flesh was turning black. The green tubes were now only streaks of deflated tissue, and the life-giving fluid no longer flowed up into the body of the house. From up above came a deep rumbling sound and a great splintering, as though a mountain of rocks were grinding together. Brian ran towards the far wall and, quickly scrambling up into the cave, found Rosemary waiting to welcome him with outstretched arms. "Keep down," he warned. "All hell is going to break loose at any moment." They lay face down upon the floor, and Brian had to raise his head to see the final act. The green light was fading, but before it went he had a last glimpse of the woman staring blankly at the place where Petros had lain. She was patting Carlo's head. Then the ceiling came down, and for a while there was only darkness filled with a mighty rumbling and the crashing of falling rock. Fantasy tumbling down into the pit of reality. Time passed, and the air cleared as the dust settled, and presently, like a glimmer of hope in a valley of despair, a beam of light struck the entrance to the cave. Brian looked out and then up. 20 feet above was a patch of blue sky. They came up from the pit, bruised, clothes torn but happy to be alive. They trudged hand in hand out across the moors, and after a while looked back to see a pile of rocks that, at this distance, could have been mistaken for a ruined house. "We will never talk about this to anyone," Brian said. "One does not talk about one's nightmares. They are so ridiculous in the light of day." Rosemary nodded. "We slept. We dreamed. Now we are awake." They walked on. Two figures that distance diminished until they became minute specks on a distant horizon. Then they were gone. The early morning breeze caressed the summer grass. Harebells smiled up at a benign sky, and a pair of rabbits played hide-and-seek among the fallen rocks. To all outward appearances, the moors were at peace. Then a rabbit screamed, and a stoat raised blood-dripping jaws. And that is the end of that one. Which I probably should have added a content warning for. Visceral body horror! And I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. And remember, good night out there, whatever you are.